in this presentation, we will cover Weather of Ancient Egypt by Kirsten Green. And I'll start off by telling you a little bit about ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt thrived in about 5,500 BC, and it fell in 332 BC when it was invaded by Alexander the Great. Weather in ancient Egypt was the center of their civilization. They depended on it for absolutely almost all of their means to survive. And ancient Egypt had many gods, but they had multiple different weather gods. Egyptian weather patterns are very, very different from those that we experience in the United States. And here you will just see pictures from ancient Egypt. There's, on the left, you will see pyramids and sphinx, and then on the right is just some paintings of like the cattle and the people, and on the bottom is an example of what maybe one of the pharaohs would have looked like. Ancient Egyptians depended on the weather for their food. They needed the correct kind of weather in order to have successful crops. They had crops such as wheat and barley. They depended on the flooding of the Nile River every year in late fall in order to be able to have natural fertilizers and get correct amount of water to their crops and their sheep and their cattle, which they also ate. And the natural flooding of the Nile River usually happened in the fall, and this is how they would determine what time of the year it was, because once the flooding began, they would know that it was fall, and it would come because of the rain. The rain only happened in ancient Egypt during fall and winter seasons. Okay, the Nile River was the center of ancient Egyptian culture. The people started gathering there because it provided them with everything that they needed. This is how ancient Egyptian civilization got started, and they depended on the annual flooding in order to get everything that they needed. That the river would bring in fertile land and clay and silt, and the fertilizers they would use for crop areas, and they would use the clay and the silt in order to make their pottery and their tools. And the river was also used for recreational purpose. It was used for work and for play, and they would play in the river they'd make up games and go boating, go swimming. Sometimes they would even have races. Okay, and this slide is just some pictures of the Nile River and the floods. The first picture on your left, it shows the area of Egypt and how close it really was built to the Nile River. Then the middle picture shows how the floods would take over the entire land where the crops were planted. Then the last picture, it shows just a painting or a drawing of how they would build tools to get the water out of the river, to have water for themselves, to have water for their other plants, and water for their sheep and their cattle. On the very bottom, there is a picture of Egyptian men and their camels and their horses, and just how serious the flooding really was. Ancient Egyptians had a lot of different myths and a lot of different gods. They had a lot of rituals they performed and traditions that they would do, and they even would build pyramids and buildings that were dedicated to specific gods. And the Egyptians, they had no shortage of weather gods or goddesses, and the Egyptians, they would sometimes even practice animal sacrifice as a way to please the gods and to pretty much bribe the gods into giving them what they wanted. And one of their rituals that they would do, as everyone knows, is the mummification process. And the hot and humid weather in ancient Egypt was one of the things that really helped the mummification process go by a lot smoother. Okay, first we are going to take a look at Ra. He is the god of the sun, and Ra was considered to be created by the god Adam, and Adam was the god of creation. Ra was considered to be the most important god of weather because the ancient Egyptians had 12 hours of constant sunlight, so Ra would have been the most important of the sky. He represented warmth, light, and the growth of the Egyptian crops and the Egyptian community. Ra was credited with the creation of all the seasons. He had two children himself. It says in ancient myths that he spit them out himself, and their names are Tefnut, the goddess of the rain, and Shu, the god of the air. Okay, now we are going to take a look at Tefnut. And Tefnut is actually the daughter of Ra, and it is said in ancient myths that Ra actually spit her and her twin brother Shu out, and her name translates in ancient Egyptian actually to spit. And as you can see, she was depicted as a human with a lion's head in the Egyptian hieroglyphics. She was the goddess of rain, moisture, and dew. And she actually married her brother Shu. He is the god of air, and this was not uncommon in Egyptian myths. She had two children, or they had two children together. Their names were Nut and Geb. Alright, now we are going to look at Shu. And Shu was the other child of Ra, the god of the sun. Shu was considered to be the god of the air and the wind. Shu was the brother to Tefnut, and he actually married his sister, and they had two children. And he was considered to be calming and cooling. He was pretty much the peaceful force of the weather gods. Now we are going to take a look at Nut. And Nut is the daughter of brother and sister Tefnut and Shu. And Nut was originally known as the nighttime goddess of the sky, but later on in ancient Egyptian myths, she just became referred to as just the goddess of the sky. And Nut is usually portrayed as a star covered naked woman who arches over the earth. She has four children: Osiris, Set, Isis, Nymphothys, and sometimes in myths she is the mother of Horus. And Nut and her grandfather Ra actually have a fight over whether or not she should be able to have children in the myth of Nut and Ra. Okay, now we're going to look at the myth of Nut and Ra. And this was actually a fight between Ra, the god of the sun, and Nut, the god of the sky. And as you know, Nut was actually the granddaughter of Ra. And it all started when Ra feared that Nut was going to take over his position. Ra was ultimately afraid that Nut was going to have children that were going to be more powerful than him, that they would be more important than him, especially if she was to have a son. And Nut was actually, much like her mother and her father, she was married to her brother Geb, and they wanted to have children, but because of Ra's fear of being overpowered, he made a law that Nut could not have any children any day of the year. And actually, at this time in ancient Egypt, there was only 360 days in every year. So along came Thoth, and he is the god of knowledge. And he made it to where there were enough moonlight lit hours for there to be 5 extra days in every year. This made it to where there were 365 days in the year. That meant that Nut and Geb had 5 extra days to have children. And they actually had 4. And they were Osiris, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. And in some ancient Egyptian myths, Nut and Geb are the parents of Horus. Okay, and now we have pictures of all of the gods or goddesses. And the biggest picture you'll see here is the woman arced over all the separate gods, and that is actually Nut. She was the god of the sky. And then the woman you'll see sitting down who has a lioness head, that is actually Tefnut. And to the right of Tefnut, in the middle, you will see Shu, the god of air. And then to the right of him, you will see one of the ways that Ra, the god of the sun, was depicted. And he is actually depicted as a human in some myths, and then other he is a human with a bird-like head. Okay, now we are going to look at some of the basic weather conditions that they had in ancient Egypt. Okay, and as most people know, Egypt is mostly hot, humid, and dry. And in Egypt, they have 12 hours of sunshine during the day. And at nighttime, Egypt is actually rather cool. It can actually get down to as low as 45 degrees Fahrenheit every night. And in the summer times, it can actually reach up to 107 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. Rain in ancient Egypt is important, but it is a very rare thing. It only rains in Egypt in the winter hours, sometimes the fall hours, but that is usually the only time that you will see rain in Egypt. Okay, now we are going to look at the seasons in Egypt. These would be the seasons that they had in ancient Egyptian times as well. In Egypt, they have a mild winter and a hot summer. And the winter months are usually November through April. And during the winter season, it rains in most of the parts in Egypt, but not all of them. And this is the time that you will have the annual flooding and the thunderstorms. The temperature during the winter season can get to as low as 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and this is usually happens at nighttime. They have hot summers, and the summer season lasts from May to October, and temperatures can get up to 107 degrees. And this is when they have the dust storms and the natural disaster that is called Kamism, and it is a rather large dust storm that they have every year. Okay, and now we have some pictures of the variation of weather that they have in ancient Egypt. And the very left picture is an example of a dust storm or a sandstorm that they have in Egypt. And the right top picture is a picture of just a normal sunny day, probably a summer day. And the right bottom is a picture or an example of one of the wintry, colder, rainy days that they have in ancient Egypt near one of the pyramids. Okay, here is a list of some of the natural hazards, natural disasters that they have in Egypt, or some of the hardships and obstacles they would have faced in ancient Egypt. Okay, in Egypt, they have sandstorms. That's usually in the summertime. They have drought, which would most likely also happen in the summertime, because that is the time that the Nile River flooding would be going away and the water levels would be going back to normal. They have a sometimes drastic climate change, and that can throw their crops off or mess with their houses. And they have, of course, the floods, which take some adapting and some adjusting to, but they are more used to the floods, so that one's not a big dramatic change. And they also have some pretty extreme earthquakes from time to time in Egypt, and that, of course, will mess with their houses and their buildings and just any of the things they have set up around their community. And if you look in the top left corner, you will see a picture of what the flooding would have looked like. And in the bottom left corner, you will see a picture of an example of some of the sandstorms. On the top right corner, there is an example of drought, and you'll see the same thing underneath that. It's just an example of what the drought makes the land look like. You see that there are no crops, and on the bottom it starts to kill the trees and just all of the greenery around them. Okay, this is a list of the things that Egyptians needed to change in order to adapt to their weather. There is clothing, housing, their irrigation techniques, and their leisurely outdoor activities. This is Egyptian clothing, and the Egyptians would wear many different things to ward off the sunshine and the heat. They wore very lightweight clothing. Most of the time, they would wear skirts, and most of them did not wear shirts. They wore wigs to keep the sun off their shaved heads, to keep them from getting burnt. The clothing was made from the linen that they pulled from flaxseed plants. And the children actually didn't wear any clothes until they were 6 years old. Okay, here are some examples of Egyptian clothing. There are many different styles of clothing, and most of the time, the royalty, the pharaohs, their clothing would be a little bit more fancier, but a lot of them just wore the least amount of clothing that they could. And you also see in these pictures some of the examples of the wigs that they would wear in order to keep the sun off their head. Okay, another way that Egyptians would adapt to the hot weather is by making different houses. And their houses were usually made out of mud brick and straw. Most of the time, there would be windows in the houses in order to catch the breezes at night, and some of them would even lay on their roofs at nighttime to stay cool. Houses were painted white in order to keep them cooler. Here we have some examples of Egyptian housing. In one of the pictures, you can see an example of how the houses were painted white in order to keep them cooler. And the other ones, you will see a lot of windows in order to let the breeze go all the way through the house whenever they would get one. And you'll notice that they all have flat roofs in order for them to be able to lay on them at night or just to go up there and do their work where it was cooler. And many of the houses were built directly next to the river so that they would have quick and easy access to the water. One of the most important aspects of their agriculture and their crops was the way that the Egyptians used irrigation. And Egyptians were one of the very first people who developed types of irrigation. They used the basin irrigation system, and in this system they would basically build canals and build walls in order to keep the water up and away from their housing and the areas where they did not want the floodwaters to go. The basin irrigation system basically left them in control of where the floodwaters would be going. They would build tools and special devices to help them get the water out of the flood area and carry it to their certain crops that were farther away, or to use it to drink water themselves, or to carry to their cattle and their sheep and any of the other animals they had. One of the tools that they used the most was called the shaduf, and the shaduf was basically a lever and pulley system that had a bucket on the end, and they would dip the bucket in the water and they would be able to pull it up out of the water, and it would be full of water that they could carry off to the certain areas that they needed it. Here are some of the leisurely activities that they would do on the river or next to the water. They had a lot of many different river games that they would play for, kids or in order to pass time. Some of the pictures that they have, people believe that they were learning how to play leapfrog. That was one of the popular river games. They also made it an activity or a sport to go fishing, which they also used the fish, of course, for food. And another leisurely activity was swimming. They would have swimming races and just kind of to see who was the best swimmer. And they also went boating. They would just go for boat rides, or they would even have boat races. Here are some of the examples of Egyptian people, and their sports or games that they would take part in on the river. On the very top picture, you can see a group of men fishing in the river. On the very bottom, there is a picture of two boats and a group of people. I don't know if they are in a competition or if they are just enjoying a boat ride. On the very right, there is a picture of a large group of men, and they're just in a large boat. Okay, and here we just have a list of the way that modern day Egyptians have adapted to the weather and the heat and the humidity, as opposed to the way that the ancient Egyptians had to do things. And of course, modern day, they have a lot more resources, a lot more technology. The life is a lot more luxurious than it would have been in ancient times. and they have the clothing that they wear is much like the clothing we wear in the United States, but a lot of the women do still wear the light linen headdresses. And then their housing, most of the Egyptian people, they live with their parents until they are married, and they usually live in apartment buildings, and the apartment buildings do have a lot of windows, and of course now they have the convenience of air conditioning and things of that sort. Nowadays, the only activities that the Nile River gets are boating. There are a lot of sailboats and cruise ships and yachts, and the Nile River is mostly a tourist attraction or a attraction for the wealthy people. Now, the river is used for some farming and some businesses, but mostly it is used as a tourist attraction. Okay, these are some of the examples of Egyptian housing and Egyptian leisurely activities. The very first two pictures on the left are of the Nile River and the sailboats or the yachts and the cruise ships that go out on it. On the very top, the middle, and the right, there are two pictures, and the one in the middle is an example of Egyptian apartment buildings. The one on the very right is an example of a larger Egyptian house that would probably be owned by a wealthier person, and you can see that it still looks like mud bricks, and there are a lot of windows. On the very bottom right is an example of how the Egyptian people usually dress today.